Picture a fire on the edge of a marsh. It's cold. The sky is the color of wet ash. Around this small flame sits a group of people, hunters, foragers, families, some of the first human beings ever to walk this particular corner of the earth. They've eaten. Duck bones and stone tools lie scattered in the dirt around them. And now, in the quiet after the meal, one of them reaches into a pouch, pulls out a twist of dried leaves, and holds it close to the fire. This is not a story about a bad habit. This is a story about one of the oldest relationships in human history. The relationship between our species, a handful of strange plants, and the smoke that rises when we burn them. Because that fire on the edge of the marsh, it burned 12,300 years ago. And what those people were doing beside it may be the single oldest evidence we have of humans using tobacco anywhere on the planet. So the real question isn't, when did humans start smoking? The real question is, why did we ever start in the first place? To understand smoking, you have to understand that it required two inventions to collide. The first was fire. Our ancestors had been taming fire for hundreds of thousands of years before any of this, cooking with it, sleeping beside it, using it to push back the dark. Fire was already the center of human life. It was where people gathered, where food was made safe, where stories were told. The second ingredient was stranger. Somewhere along the way, humans discovered that certain plants don't just feed the body, they change the mind. Chew them, brew them, or burn them, and the world shifts. Pain softens. Fatigue lifts. The boundary between you and everything else seems to thin out. Every human culture that has ever existed on every continent found some version of these plants. Coffee, tea, the opium poppy, coca leaves, and again, independently, in places that had never heard of each other, plants you could burn and breathe. Smoking is what happens when the oldest technology we have, fire, meets the plants that alter who we are. And it turns out we figured that out almost as soon as we possibly could. Let's go back to that marsh. The place is in what is now northern Utah in the United States, a stretch of the Great Salt Lake Desert. Today, it's cracked, white flatland. But at the end of the last ice age, it was a lush wetland, full of ducks and reeds and running water. Archaeologists call the spot the Wishbone Site. When researchers excavated an ancient fireplace there, they found exactly what you'd expect from an Ice Age hunting camp. Spear tips, more than 2,000 fragments of bone, most of them from waterfowl. Charred willow wood used as fuel, and then, tucked in the ash, 4 tiny charred seeds. They belonged to a wild tobacco plant. And here's the detail that makes this so remarkable. Those seeds weren't growing there. The nearest wild tobacco would have been in the foothills, more than 13 kilometers away. Someone carried tobacco to this fire on purpose. And tobacco seeds don't even burn well, so they weren't fuel. They were the leftovers of something a person brought, used, and discarded into the flames. Radiocarbon dating of the burned wood put that fire at roughly 12,300 years old. That's staggering. It means people were using tobacco almost as soon as human beings arrived in the Americas. Thousands of years before farming, before pottery, before cities, before writing. Before almost everything we think of as civilization, humans were already sitting by the fire with tobacco in hand. For a long time, the record looked very different. The oldest hard evidence of tobacco use used to be a set of smoking pipes from Alabama, with nicotine residue still inside them, dating back about 3,300 years. Impressive. But the Utah seeds pushed that story back another 9,000 years in a single discovery. As the lead archaeologist on the Utah find put it, it's very human to imbibe. Think of your morning cup of coffee. Why wouldn't people back then have reached for something too? Now, here's an honest twist. Those 4 seeds in Utah tell us people were using tobacco. They don't quite tell us they were smoking it. Not yet. Because before there were pipes, there were older, simpler ways to get a plant's effects. People chewed tobacco leaves. They sucked on twisted wads of leaf and stem. They may have brewed it or held it against the gums. The nicotine gets in either way. In fact, thousands of years later, some ancestral Puebloan peoples of the American Southwest were still chewing tobacco rather than burning it. So the deepest roots of the human-tobacco relationship might not be smoke at all. They might be a bitter leaf tucked in a cheek beside an ice age fire. But smoke was coming. And when it arrived, it changed everything. Because smoke does something no other method can. It's fast. Burn a plant and breathe it, and the active compounds cross from your lungs into your blood in seconds. It's the most direct route into the brain a plant can take, short of a needle. Once humans discovered that, there was no going back. And here's the part that should genuinely give you chills. Humans didn't invent smoking once. We invented it over and over, in isolation, on opposite sides of the world, with no contact between us. Travel about halfway around the planet from Utah, and roughly 2,500 years ago, high in the Pamir Mountains of what is now western China, mourners gathered at a cemetery on a wind-scoured plateau. They dug graves. They laid out their dead beneath strips of black and white stone, and into the tombs they placed wooden braziers, small burners filled with hot stones. When modern scientists analysed the residue baked into those braziers, they found cannabis. Not the low-strength hemp people had grown for rope and seed for thousands of years, but cannabis unusually high in THC, the compound that gets you high. 9 of the 10 burners carried the chemical signature. These people weren't burning cannabis by accident. They had sought out or cultivated the strong stuff, and they burned it in enclosed spaces during funerals, almost certainly to alter the minds of the living as they said goodbye to the dead. That is some of the earliest clear evidence anywhere on Earth of humans deliberately smoking a plant to change consciousness. Different plant, different continent, different millennium. Same idea. Fire, a chosen plant, and breath. And it kept happening. Across the Americas, indigenous peoples built an extraordinarily rich culture of smoking, with pipes, with rolled leaves, with tobacco so central to spiritual life that smoke itself became a form of prayer. Across Africa and Asia, people burned resins, herbs, and seeds in rituals stretching back thousands of years. Smoke rising toward the sky became, in culture after culture, the natural bridge between the human world and whatever lay above it. We are, it seems, a species that reaches for the burning leaf. So why did smoking so often become sacred? Why prayer, ritual, medicine, before it ever became a casual pleasure? Part of the answer is simply what smoke is. It rises. It vanishes into the air. To ancient eyes, watching a plant transform into a column of grey drifting upward toward the heavens, smoke looked like a message leaving the ground and travelling somewhere else, somewhere human beings couldn't follow. It was the visible breath of the fire. And part of it is what these plants did. When a healer breathed tobacco smoke over a patient, or a mourner inhaled cannabis beside a grave, the shift in feeling was real and immediate. A substance that could change how you felt, that travelled upward when burned, that came from a specific, carefully chosen plant. Of course, people treated it as powerful. Of course, they treated it as holy. For most of human history, smoking was not something you did to relax on a break. It was something you did at the biggest moments of life. Birth, death, healing, sealing a peace between enemies. The word we still use, a peace pipe, is an echo of a time when smoke was a promise made visible. For roughly 12,000 years, this deep, sacred, ceremonial relationship with tobacco stayed almost entirely within the Americas. And then, on a single day, two worlds that had never met slammed into each other. In 1492, the ships of Christopher Columbus reached the islands of the Caribbean. The people there greeted the strangers with gifts, food, and among the offerings, bundles of dried leaves. The Europeans had no idea what they were. Some accounts say the leaves were thrown away at first, discarded as worthless. But two of Columbus's men watched the locals roll those leaves, light them, and draw the smoke into their bodies. One of them, a sailor named Rodrigo de Jerez, tried it himself. He carried the habit home to Spain. And here's a small, human, almost comic tragedy. When Rodrigo smoked in his hometown, blowing clouds out of his mouth and nose, his neighbours were horrified. A man breathing smoke could only be possessed by the devil. He was reported to the Inquisition and reportedly imprisoned for years. By the time he got out, smoking had begun to spread across Europe, and no one thought it was demonic anymore. The first European smoker may have been jailed for the very habit that would soon conquer the continent. Tobacco spread through Europe with astonishing speed, and as it spread, it transformed. The sacred smoke of the Americas became, in Europe, something new, fashionable, medicinal, and above all, profitable.
A French diplomat named Jean Nicot promoted tobacco as a wonder drug, a cure for headaches, wounds, almost anything. He was so associated with the plant that his name got attached to it forever. The active chemical in tobacco, the one that keeps people coming back, is nicotine, named after him. In England, the courtier Sir Walter Raleigh helped make pipe smoking stylish among the wealthy. What had been a ceremony among indigenous American peoples became a status symbol among European aristocrats, a thing to be done with fine pipes and expensive imported leaf. But the biggest transformation wasn't cultural, it was economic. Europeans realized that tobacco could be grown, shipped, sold, and craved. It was one of the first truly global commodities driven by pure desire. And to grow it on the scale the world now demanded, Colonial powers built vast plantations across the Americas and worked them with enslaved people torn from their homes. The sacred plant of the fireside had become the engine of empires. A plant that had once meant prayer now meant profit, on a scale that reshaped the whole world. Not everyone was thrilled. Almost as soon as smoking arrived in Europe, the backlash began. In the early 1600s, King James I of England wrote an entire furious pamphlet attacking the habit. He called smoking a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs. Sit with that for a second. 400 years ago, long before anyone understood the actual science, a king looked at people breathing smoke and concluded, essentially, this cannot be good for you. He was more right than he could possibly have known. And then, being a king who also noticed how much money there was in it, he taxed tobacco heavily rather than banning it. The pattern of governments condemning smoking with one hand and profiting from it with the other was set almost from the very beginning. For centuries, smoking stayed a relatively slow, handmade thing. Pipes had to be packed. Cigarettes, where they existed, had to be rolled one at a time, by hand. A skilled worker could only make a few per minute. That natural limit kept smoking in check. Then, in the 1880s, a machine changed the entire course of the story. An inventor named James Bonsack built a device that could roll cigarettes automatically. Thousands upon thousands of them, far faster than any human hand. Suddenly, cigarettes could be produced in numbers no one had ever imagined, cheaply enough for almost anyone to afford. Combine that machine with modern advertising, mass printing, and the reach of industrial economies, and you get the 20th century. The century when smoking went from a habit to a phenomenon. Cigarettes were handed out to soldiers in both world wars. They were sold as glamorous, as sophisticated, as healthy. Doctors appeared in advertisements. Film stars smoked on screen. For a few decades, in much of the world, not smoking was the unusual choice. A relationship that began beside an Ice Age fire had become the most widespread drug habit in human history, practiced by more than 1 billion people. And then came the reckoning. Through the middle of the 20th century, scientists slowly, carefully, and undeniably connected smoking to disease. Lung cancer, heart disease, a long list of ways that the smoke could quietly take the body apart. King James's 400-year-old instinct turned out to be devastatingly correct. What followed was one of the great public health turnarounds in history. Warnings on packets, bans on advertising, smoke-free spaces, enormous efforts to help people quit. In many countries, smoking rates fell dramatically. A habit that had felt permanent, even inevitable, went into retreat. But notice what did not happen. Smoking didn't disappear. It shape-shifted. Vapes and e-cigarettes arrived, delivering that same ancient hit of nicotine through modern technology. The newest chapter in a 12,000-year-old search for the fastest way to get a plant into the blood. The fire got smaller. The plant got processed. But the fundamental thing, a human being breathing in a substance that changes how they feel, is exactly what those people were doing by the Marsh at the end of the Ice Age. So, when did humans first start smoking? The honest answer is that we started reaching for these plants almost the moment we could. 12,300 years ago in a Utah wetland, someone brought tobacco to a fire. 2,500 years ago in the mountains of China, mourners breathed cannabis smoke over their dead. And across the whole world, again and again, in cultures that never met, human beings arrived at the same quiet discovery, that fire and the right plant, together, could carry you somewhere else. We turned that discovery into prayer, into medicine, into ritual and empire and addiction, and one of the deadliest habits our species has ever known. The whole tangled history of what we are is written in that rising column of smoke. Our creativity, our hunger for meaning, our brilliance at building, and our genius for harming ourselves in the process. That fire on the edge of the marsh went out 12,000 years ago. But in a strange way, it never really did. Every time someone, somewhere lights up, that same ancient flame flickers back to life. The oldest conversation between humans, fire, and the plants that change us. And it's still burning.